So now that we've been studying some of the issues concerning global security, we're going to talk a little bit about humanitarian intervention. To do that, I have with me today Professor Eric Heinze. Eric Heinze is a specialist on this subject. Professor Heinze, could you tell us a little bit about what you mean by humanitarian intervention?
Well, humanitarian intervention is basically war. It's the use of military force by a state or group of states in the territory of another state, usually for the purpose of explicitly trying to halt or avert humanitarian disasters.
So is it humanitarian aid?
No, that's an important distinction I think we have to make is between humanitarian intervention and other less forcible intervention measures such as humanitarian aid. And the key distinction here is that humanitarian intervention does quite literally entail the use of military force. It is in effect war. Whereas humanitarian aid is more akin to providing the basic necessities for individuals to survive, food, medical attention, and so on.
So what are some of the criteria that we might use to determine whether it's proper to intervene in some sort of humanitarian crisis?
Well, since humanitarian intervention is in effect war, it entails very high risks. There's always going to be the attendant death and destruction that accompany the use of military force. And so we want to have a rather high bar for when we consider humanitarian intervention to be permissible. And so one requirement of intervention that most people agree upon is that we have to have what are in effect large-scale and widespread human rights violations. The idea here is that you wouldn't want to risk going to war over minor or small-scale human rights abuses, which quite frankly take place in many countries throughout the world. So what we're talking about here is responding to genocidal type acts of large-scale mass atrocities.
So there's this concept in the global community that we tend to refer to as the responsibility to protect. Is that what you're talking about? That sometimes states, governments, countries, people have a responsibility to protect others?
To a certain extent. Responsibility to protect is a broader notion than humanitarian intervention. I think you can understand humanitarian intervention as part of a responsibility to protect, but really when we're talking about a responsibility to protect, we're effectively talking about two levels of responsibility on the part of members of the international community. On one hand, we're talking about the responsibility of states to protect their own populations against human rights violations. And on the other hand, we're talking about the responsibility of the international community to respect people in these other countries, to protect them from human rights violations should their country fail in doing so, or should their country be the perpetrator of these human rights violations. And so while this is a broader notion than humanitarian intervention, certainly the concept of humanitarian intervention does fit within that broad definition. Although there are other things that also fit within that too, such as trying to prevent these types of human rights violations in the first place, trying to assist countries in having the capacity to respect human rights, as well as trying to rebuild these countries after many of them have endured very long and destructive conflicts.
So what about some examples? We have quite a few, unfortunately, in the international community, but we also have examples of where governments, states, international organizations like the UN, for example, don't intervene, and we have examples of where they do intervene. So how do you explain this? Can you give us a few examples?
Sure. One of the most glaring instances of non-intervention, that is a case of clearly large-scale human rights violations that did not attract international attention, was the Rwandan genocide of 1994, where we had nearly 1 million people killed in the matter of 100 days. And this is a rather dark spot on the history of the United Nations and the international community in the sense that very little, if anything, was done to try to avert these atrocities when we know that something could have been done to do so. And so that is an example of non-intervention, and there are a variety of reasons why you could argue that no intervention was forthcoming. An example of a humanitarian intervention most recently, you could point to the Libya intervention by NATO a couple years ago in 2011. Whereby you have in the context of the Arab Spring, you have uprisings that turned violent. You have the response of the regime being quite brutal, rising to the level of crimes against humanity, certainly. And in response, the United Nations passed a resolution authorizing NATO to enforce a no-fly zone for the specific purpose of protecting civilians. This is, in effect, a kind of humanitarian intervention. But it could also, I think, be construed as an intervention into another country's civil war, and that's where that particular intervention attracted a lot of criticism and became quite controversial.
So what might motivate any particular actor to intervene in a case where, let's say in the case of Rwanda or some other country, some other crisis, when there isn't necessarily anything in it for them? I mean, can we find an example of that, or what might motivate actors to do something like that?
Well, ideally, and I realize we do not live in an ideal world, but ideally states would be motivated out of a sense of moral obligation in order to effectively alleviate human suffering and prevent acts of genocide. If that were the world that we lived in, it would be nice. Unfortunately, most of the time, states are not going to risk going to war and expending their own assets, both human and military, for someone else's purposes. And so normally when we have instances of humanitarian intervention, it is in those instances where the interveners usually also have another interest at stake. Now, that doesn't mean that they necessarily use humanitarianism as a pretext for going to war. It just means that normally a state must have or is expected to have some sort of interest in the area in which it's intervening before it will seriously consider doing so. More recently, though, people have argued that a state's interests are something very complex. They're very difficult to put your finger on. And to a certain extent, states do understand their interests in lying in protecting human beings, in effect preventing these types of atrocities from happening. And so to the extent that states identify themselves as protectors of human rights and perceive it to be in their interests to protect human rights, particularly in other countries, this might make them more inclined to want to actually resort to military force, if it comes to that, in order to protect these populations from these sorts of terrible crimes.
So students, tell us what you think. When is it appropriate to intervene in a humanitarian crisis, and when is it not? Let us know.